Maryse Alberti may not be as well known by mainstream audiences as some other cinematographers which I've featured in this series, but the strength of her career as a cinematographer speaks for itself. She has a prolific track record in both documentary and fiction filmmaking, often choosing films that deal with real subject matter, true-to-life characters, and situations that are interesting and elevated but grounded in reality. In today's episode, I'll give some background to Alberti's career, go over her philosophy on cinematography, and the gear that she has used in order to translate her vision to the screen.
I grew up in the south of France. I didn't have a TV. I didn't see a TV until I was 12 years old. I just fell in love with movies when I first came to the States, because I stayed with people who had the TV in every room.
After moving to the US in 1973, Alberti developed a career in capturing images, starting out by working as a still photographer in a field which isn't exactly the traditional roadmap to a career as a feature film DP.
And I'm sure you know that I ended up on the X-rated
Yes, ma'am.
set where I was the still photographer. When I started to work on X-rated movies, I met people, the crews in New York were then like young people out of Columbia or NYU. It was kind of the training ground. One of the training grounds. Since I didn't do a film school, that was kind of my film school.
After starting out making film industry contacts in the X-rated world, she then got involved in shooting documentaries. Her break as a cinematographer came when she shot H2 Worker, which won the jury prize for Best Documentary and Best Cinematographer at Sundance, and launched her career as a DOP. Throughout the years, she has worked as cinematographer in both the documentary and the feature world for many esteemed directors, such as Todd Haynes, Stephanie Black, Martin Scorsese, Ryan Coogler, and Ron Howard. Alberti's career mix of documentary and fiction has resulted in a style of working based on realism and cinema verite. Cinema verite, or observational filmmaking, is a documentary style which attempts to capture reality in a truthful manner by observing reality and trying to draw attention away from the presence of the camera. Although paradoxically, some argue that the very presence of the camera alters how reality is captured. Either way, to blend into the background as much as possible, this style is often characterized by a minimal gear footprint. The very act of using less gear will impact the look of how a film is captured.
From a cinematographer point of view, you learn how to work with very simple tools with very few people. Docs it's another way of working. It's more instinctual. It's less intellectual.
However, Alberti still recommends thinking about the subject of the documentary and basing the photography on the story. Therefore, although I'd argue that a portion of her photography can be characterized by a verite look, her style does of course change depending on the nature of the story. A key difference between her work on documentaries and features comes from the level of intentionality. Long-form work is more of an intellectual process with lots of prior reflection on creating a visual language, which is then executed by exercising and maintaining ultimate photographic control. Whereas in documentary, there's more scope to embrace improvisation and capture moments as they play out in real time. For most documentary interviews, Alberti will arrive at a location without seeing it beforehand. Whereas when working on features, she'll usually have up to 8 weeks of prep time to scout locations and discuss production design with the director. An example of how her taste for a natural verite look transfers over to her fiction work can be found in The Wrestler.
The whole film has a very naturalistic look. So when we look at location and when I went to look at the wrestling match, I tried to make it work for the drama of the film, but to keep it as real as possible, so you felt that you were in a real place.
She did this by using natural-looking lighting and motivated handheld camera movement, skills which she had developed during her work in documentaries. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community which is perfect for creative individuals with a range of classes on topics such as cinematography, directing, color grading, editing, and many others. Since I'm trying to upskill my color grading at the moment, which is an important ability for a modern cinematographer to have, I recently took a class by professional colorist Fred Trevino. In it, he went over an introduction of grading and the order of operations when using DaVinci Resolve software. So whether you're a hobbyist, looking to get started, or a working professional, Skillshare has a perfect class for your level. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today.
In general, I prefer film? It depends on the story. Some story are best told in a digital world. Like in documentary, I think it's a question of economics.
When it comes to selecting gear for a project, she of course considers which equipment can achieve the desired look, but perhaps equally as important is the practical side of the gear selection. When she started her career, shooting on film was the only viable option for attaining a decent quality image. A lot of her early documentary work was shot in 16mm, due to it being a cheaper medium than 35mm, which was needed to facilitate the lower budgets of documentary and higher shooting ratios. She mainly shot with Atton cameras such as the lightweight Atton LTR-54. Even though 16mm was cheaper, it was still a costly process to photograph a documentary.
When we did H2 Worker, we went to Jamaica with 5 rolls of film because we didn't have any money. And you had to be very careful the question you ask and when you roll.
At approximately 11 minutes of runtime per roll, this meant they had less than an hour of footage which they could shoot, compared to today where a single interview may be longer than an hour. Working on digital now allows filmmakers to be far more free about when they roll the camera, and allows directors to have a conversation in interviews rather than asking very specific questions in an economic way. Alberti therefore prefers the practicality of digital over film when shooting documentary. Its economic benefits, ability to roll for extended periods, and smaller size outweigh the look of film. She now uses cameras such as the Canon C300, the Sony Venice, or variations of the Alexa for feature films, with different lenses like Hawk V-Lite anamorphics, Master Primes, Cooke S4s, or Angenieux zooms. Although it is dependent on the story and subject matter of the project, much of her work has featured extensive handheld camera movement, which is motivated by the movement of the characters. Perhaps this is due to directors wanting to work with her for her experience in producing quality handheld work in a verite style. She has operated the camera herself, but for larger feature films which require a more intensive focus on lighting, she has delegated the handheld work to camera operators. As a lot of the movement tracks the movement of the characters, it can make scenes feel a bit more real, like the actions of the actors are being observed rather than performed deliberately in multiple takes. Alberti's lighting does occasionally differ between projects depending on the type of story, but a lot of her lighting tries to be as naturalistic as possible. So naturalistic that the audience doesn't even notice that the space is lit. She does this by only supplementing the sources of light that are already present in the location. For example, if sunlight is already coming through a window, she may place a film light like an HMI outside that window to mimic the same direction and quality of the natural light. This is particularly necessary in fiction where consistent lighting conditions are required throughout a scene, which may be shot over the course of half a day. Where possible, she'll place lights out of sight, so that they can shoot a scene 360 degrees without being limited by lighting gear. She also uses textiles and diffusion gels to soften the quality of the natural or artificial light. For interiors, she'll sometimes place practical lights in a location or use additional lights overhead like Mac 2000s to give the room a bright enough exposure to shoot in, or to balance the brightness of different levels of illumination. If I had to sum up her style, I'd say that Maryse Alberti is a cinematographer whose work in fiction is an extension of her documentary work. Many of the characteristics of cinema verite, such as a handheld camera and naturalistic lighting, are carried over onto the feature films which she shoots, but are executed on long-form jobs in a more considered, deliberate, and controlled manner than her more improvisational documentary camera work. Her ability to capture a realistic feeling portrait of reality has contributed to her being an incredibly influential DP in both the world of fiction and documentary alike. Happy New Year, and a special thank you to everyone for your dedicated support, from the patrons to the subscribers who have bought merch, and everyone who watches and is able to, hopefully, take away something from these videos. This year I've also got some exciting plans for the channel, so follow me on the social media channels in the description for any updates or announcements if that's your thing, or else stay tuned for future videos. Otherwise, until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.